Good morning. My name is Bob Beck, and I will serve as a moderator for today's program. I am pleased to welcome you to the Monadnock Summer Lyceum with today's guest speaker, Joseph Nye. Before we get started, I'd like to thank today's musician, Zach Burrows, for recording the music many of you enjoyed while waiting for the live broadcast to begin. Also, a sincere thank you to the Verney Foundation for generously sponsoring today's event. For many years, the Monadnock Summer Lyceum has brought outstanding, world-class speakers to the Monadnock region to serve as catalysts to inform, engage, and inspire an active citizenry on local, national, and global issues. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum is supported primarily through contributions from our audience. We deeply appreciate your donations, which this year may be made on our website or by mailing your donation. During this challenging time, we need your help more than ever. Today's talk is being recorded and will soon be available as a podcast and as a video on our website, monadnocklyceum.org. The presentation will also be rebroadcast on WSMN 95.3 next Sunday at 7 a.m. and at 4 p.m. and on WUML 91.5 this coming Wednesday at 10:30 and next Sunday at 3 p.m. As is the tradition of the Lyceum, after the presentation, our speaker will answer questions from the audience. Please submit your questions by using the live comments section on Facebook or YouTube, or send them to our email at monlyceum@gmail.com. Once again, that's MON Lyceum, all one word, at gmail.com. After the broadcast, we encourage you to provide feedback on today's program, suggestions for next summer's speakers, or join our mailing list through our website. As mentioned before, our speaker today is Professor Joseph Nye. Our guest speaker is widely recognized as one of the most important foreign policy intellects of the past 40 years. With an academic background, Princeton, Oxford, and Harvard, that represents the absolute best in higher education. He is also one of the few academics who was equally successful in the Byzantine bureaucracy of the US government, something that I know well, winning awards for his service at the Departments of State and Defense, as well as the National Intelligence Council. He is the author of numerous books on foreign policy, the most recent of which, Do Morals Matter in Foreign Policy, he will speak to today. His influence, however, is much more enduring than books written or medals received for distinguished government service, as he is one of the rare scholars whose work, particularly on the concept of soft power, changed the way policymakers, academics, and foreign policy officials approach the study and practice of international relations. This was especially poignant for me working overseas in the US foreign policy establishment over the past 30 years, seeing firsthand the potentially persuasive impact of America's soft power. This capacity to attract and co-opt, as first described by Professor Nye, I witnessed in the poor kids in the Philippines proudly sporting Michael Jordan jerseys, in the long, internationally diverse lines at Starbucks in Dubai's airport, in the popular American music and films that people across the world clamored to experience, and in the utter joy exhibited by parents in many countries in which I serve, leaving the embassy consular section with student visas for their children to study in the United States. The Monadnock Summer Lyceum, therefore, has the exceedingly good fortune, and I the unique honor, to welcome this titan of international relations scholarship, Professor Joseph Nye, to discuss his latest book, Do Morals Matter in Foreign Policy? Over to you, Professor Nye.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that generous introduction. And greetings to all my friends and future friends in the Monadnock region from Sandwich, New Hampshire, in the White Mountains, just north of you. In any case, talking about do morals matter might seem obvious. Most of us think that they do matter, but it's equally obvious to people who were involved in foreign policy and international relations that they don't matter, or that's often the conventional wisdom. In fact, when I told a colleague that I was writing a book called Do Morals Matter? Ethics and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, her comment was, "Oh, good, it'll be a short book." And indeed, that conventional wisdom is often represented in international relations theory as well as practice. I remember once speaking to a French diplomat when I was working in the State Department, and we had been discussing nuclear proliferation and nuclear weapons all day, and we were at a dinner that evening, and I said to him, "Do you ever consider the moral implications of what we've spent a whole day discussing?" And he said, "There are no moral implications. The only thing that matters are the interests of France." I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made without being aware of it. The conventional wisdom is often that the only thing that matters in international politics is national interest, and that national interest guides everything. Or put in terms of a metaphor, interests bake the cake, and politicians come along, sprinkle a little morality on it to make it pretty, kind of like icing. But it's interests that bake the cake. And there's something in that. When President Trump said America first, you would imagine that President Macron in France would say France first. After all, the president is representing, or is elected to represent, the interests of his constituents. There has to be concern for the national interest. That's a given. On the other hand, the key question is not whether you defend the national interest, it's how you define it. How narrowly do you think of your national interest? Or another way of putting it, how narrowly do you think of America first? Let me give you a sort of simplistic example to illustrate what I mean. Suppose we were sitting by the beach on one of those warm days we had a little earlier in this month, and we were reading a good book, and we're at a very interesting session and chapter of the book, and we wanted to finish it, and we heard a cry just offshore, just off the beach, of somebody crying, "Help, help." I suspect that we would put down the book and see if we could help them. If, on the other hand, we heard a cry that said, "Ayúdame, ayúdame," or it was clearly in a foreign language, would you say, "Oh no, I want to finish this chapter first"? Of course not. You would still place the emphasis on trying to rescue another human being. And in that sense, when we say national interest, it's a little bit the way we react to things in this emergency kind of situation that I described, which is you don't ignore the others, but imagine also that the call was from two children in the surf, both in trouble, and one of them was yours. Would you feel that you should rescue your child first, or you should flip a coin to see which one? No, of course you would rescue your own child. So there are additional moral obligations that go with the role of being a parent, which might affect this. But it wouldn't relate to that first example I gave of whether you would finish the chapter or whether you would try to help the drowning child. And in that way, in international politics, yes, we do place the national interest first, but not solely. We also have cosmopolitan concerns. We as humans are capable of multiple senses of loyalty and morality at the same time. I often say it's sort of like concentric circles. Yes, the innermost circle of our family or of our village or of our nation may come first, but that doesn't mean there are no other circles, that we are totally unconcerned about what's happening in other places or to other peoples. And in that way, we have to realize that while the saying it's national interest has some merit to it, the belief then that means morals don't matter is a non sequitur, because there's still a good deal left to say. So I wrote the book with two purposes, really. One was to look back at the history of the 14 presidents who occupied the office since 1945 and to ask the question, did it matter what a president's moral views were? Did it make any difference? Or another way of putting it is, you said that that morals didn't matter, would you get history wrong? And I think I've been able to establish with the case studies in the book that yes, if you take that ultra cynical view, you will indeed get history wrong. But I had another purpose in the book as well, and that was, okay, if we show that morals do matter, then how should we think about them? Because international politics is different from domestic politics or national politics, and we do have to think of the difference in context. Let me first make the point that I said about how do we know that morals matter historically. Well, in the case studies that I have in the book, perhaps one of the most interesting is Harry Truman and the issue of nuclear weapons. Harry Truman has often been criticized for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Indeed, when Oxford University offered Harry Truman an honorary degree in 1948, a famous British moral philosopher, Elizabeth Anscombe, refused to attend the ceremony because she said it was such a crime that Truman had dropped this bomb on women and children. And Truman, therefore, has been criticized, but there's much more to the story than that. What's not often remembered is that there was a third bomb, which was on Tinian Island, and that Truman told the military that he was not going to drop it. They were not given permission to drop it. And he basically said to his advisors, after he learned of the devastation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that he wasn't going to kill that many more women and children. So he got a moral lesson quite quickly. But even more interesting is if you fast forward 5 years to the Korean War, where Truman was embroiled in a losing battle on the Korean Peninsula, in the sense that the Americans had pushed the North Koreans back above the 38th parallel, but then continued on toward the Yalu River, at which point the Chinese intervened and pushed the Americans back down below the 38th parallel. And it looked like we would either lose or there would be a stalemate. President Truman was told by General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander in the region, that MacArthur could win the war for him if MacArthur was allowed to drop 20 atomic bombs on Chinese cities. Truman was told by his political advisors that if the war wound up either losing or stalemated war, it would cost him a 1952 election if he chose to run in 52. Truman basically said no, that he was not going to kill that many more women and children. So he defied MacArthur, refused his request, and the Americans wound up with a stalemated war, which is represented by the fact that Korean Peninsula is still divided at the 38th parallel to this day. Now, what's interesting here is imagine that Truman had said yes, and that he had allowed nuclear weapons to be used against Chinese cities, and that nuclear weapons had become basically a normal war-fighting weapon. At that stage, they had not become normal war-fighting weapons. Today, nuclear weapons are treated not as normal war-fighting weapons, but as weapons for deterrence. And in that sense, as Thomas Schelling, the famous Nobel Prize economist, put it in his Nobel laureate lecture, the development of the nuclear taboo, that these weapons were not normal, but were to be avoided except for deterrent purposes, was probably one of the most important decisions of the post-World War II period. If Truman hadn't made that decision, and nuclear weapons become normal war-fighting weapons, the world today would look very different than it does. So in that sense, Truman's decision, which was not entirely, but in large part based on his moral concerns, turned out to be extremely important for world history, as well as American foreign policy. So for the cynics who say, oh, morals don't matter, no, they do matter. And this is a good historical example. There are many more examples that I give in the vignettes of the 14 presidents that comprise the body of the book. But I think it's enough just to settle for this morning to prove the point that morals do matter. Now, if morals matter, then the key question we have to ask is, well, how should we think about them? What's the right way to deal with them? And in that sense, there is a strong tradition in the United States of what's sometimes called American exceptionalism, to say if we do it, it's probably okay because we're a good people. We know we're good people, therefore, when we do something, it's good. That argument is not always convincing to other nations. For example, if you tell that to Mexicans, where we took a good part of their country in the 19th century, or if you tell it to Philippines, where we used waterboarding and torture to put down a Philippine rebellion after the Spanish-American War at the beginning of the 20th century, they wouldn't necessarily accept it because the Americans do it, it's moral. Nonetheless, it's a strong tradition that we have. For example, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq in 2003, his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, said, you had to admire Bush's decision in Iraq for its morality, because he was intending to bring democracy to the Middle East. Well, again, let's grant Bush good intentions. But even if we grant him good intentions, that's not enough to make a moral judgment upon. Again, let me give you a simple example from imagined everyday life. Suppose that your daughter was attending a high school dance on a Friday night, but she's going to have SAT exams on Saturday morning, and you wanted to make sure that she got a good night's sleep. And a friend of yours said, oh, I'll pick her up at the dance, and I'll get her home early, and I'll make sure she gets home right away, and because I know she needs that good night's sleep for the SATs. And so your friend picks her up at the dance, doesn't pay enough attention to the fact that it's rained and that the road is very slick, and speeds to get her home early on this slick and winding road, skids off the road, hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. That's a hugely immoral consequence. Now, if you say, wait a minute, his intentions were good, no, that's not a sufficient justification or excuse. You'd say his intentions may have been good, but he didn't do due diligence about appropriate means, driving too fast on a slick road, and he didn't pay enough attention to the potential of unintended consequences that would be highly immoral. And you would say, on overall, this was a terrible, immoral thing, even if the intentions were good. Well, somewhat the same for the invasion of Iraq. Um, there are debates about what Bush's motives were, but let's grant him good intentions for the purpose of this argument. And then ask, did he use moral means? Did he pay due diligence to the means he used? And there were many papers written by the State Department and by the intelligence community warning against the effort to try to transform Iraq into a modern democracy. These papers were cast aside. They were paid little attention by the White House and the Pentagon. And Bush found that he didn't have the capability to produce that. And the consequences, if you look at what happened, the actual American fighting in Iraq removed Saddam Hussein. That was easy. American military forces were capable of that. But they weren't able to quell al-Qaeda in Iraq or the insurrection. Indeed, the intelligence community reported that after the American invasion, al-Qaeda in Iraq became stronger, not weaker. And that organization, al-Qaeda in Iraq, famously morphed into the Islamic State, which had terrible consequences with thousands of deaths in the region. So again, here's an action, good intentions, bad means, poor consequences or immoral consequences. And that's led me to say that when we judge morality in foreign affairs or anywhere, we should think not just of good intentions, but what I call three-dimensional morality. We should look at intentions, means, and consequences, and then try to make a balanced assessment based on all three dimensions. If you look at what a three-dimensional checklist would look like, your first question under intentions would be about the goals and means that the president has. And first, you start with the president's moral vision. Did the president express attractive values, and did those values determine his or her motives? Or did he or she have the emotional intelligence to avoid contradicting those values because of personal emotional needs? The other issue you'd ask about intentions is prudence. Did the president have the contextual intelligence to wisely balance the values pursued and the risks that were being imposed on others? So intentions becomes complicated in and of itself. When you turn to means, the second dimension of three-dimensional morality, you can ask in international relations questions about the use of force. Did the president use it with the attention to necessity, discrimination in treatment of civilians, and proportionality of benefits and damages? These are values which are encoded in international humanitarian law and in the U.S. Code of Military Code of Justice. We also ask questions relating to means about liberal issues. Did the president try to respect and use institutions at home and abroad, and to what extent were the rights of others considered? And having looked at the first dimension of intentions, the second dimension of means, we turn to the third dimension of consequences. And there are three questions that we tend to want answers to. One is a fiduciary question. Was the president a good trustee for the interests of the American people? Were the long-term interests of the country advanced? Another question we ask under consequences are cosmopolitan issues. Did the president also consider the interests of other peoples and minimize unnecessary damage to them? And the third question we want to ask under consequences are questions of educational issues. Did the president respect the truth and build credibility? Were facts respected? Did the president try to create and broaden moral discourse at home and abroad? So we find then that the simple view that intentions are what matter is nowhere near enough, and that we have to really do judgments on a three-dimensional basis. Now, it's not easy to do three-dimensional judgments, and not everything comes out equally in all circumstances, and the circumstances matter. Under certain extreme circumstances, actions which would be immoral under other circumstances might prove marginally moral. Let me give you probably the most extreme example is that I discuss in the book, which is Churchill's decision in 1940 to bomb his French allies. Remember, Hitler broke through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line, pushed the British into the sea at Dunkirk, and the Anglo-French alliance was collapsing. Hitler's about to take over France. In those circumstances, Churchill was worried about the survival of Britain, not their interests generally, but their very survival. And he felt that if the Germans were able to capture the Paris and with it the French fleet, this would tip the balance and prevent the Royal Navy from defending Britain, the island of Britain. And so Churchill bombed the French fleet before the Germans could take it over. And he killed something like 1,300 French sailors. Now you could say, my God, what a horrible things to do. In those circumstances where it was survival that was at stake, you might say, well, this is lifeboat ethics. There's no choice. But there may be such circumstances in international politics. But if you think hard about it, much of international politics, indeed most of international politics, is not like that. There are such circumstances, but they're very rare. And most situations are one in which we have to balance a variety of different national interests. Let me give you an example that, to cite to bring this home, which is the murder of the dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, in the Saudi embassy or consulate in Istanbul in the 2017-2018 period. At that stage, it was regarded as a horrendous thing to do. Khashoggi was lured into the consulate, was murdered and dismembered. And it was organized by the Saudi government. Now, when this came to the attention of President Trump, he said, well, it's a tough world out there. You know, it's a world of survivors, and we have to buy oil from the Middle East. We have to sell arms to the Middle East. Forget it. Even the conservative editorial page of the Wall Street Journal said, that's not enough. You know, you have to say something about American values. But Trump really basically assimilated the murder of Khashoggi to something equivalent to the situation that Churchill faced after the fall of France in 1940. That's not adequate moral reasoning. Now, there are difficult situations, and this was one of them. For example, to bring this up to date, President Biden criticized Trump's policy on this decision during the campaign in 2020. And then many people said, all right, what's Biden going to do about it when he takes office? Is he going to break relations with Saudi Arabia? Well, no, Biden had to realize that we did have a human rights concern, but we also had economic concerns and security concerns in the Persian Gulf. So what Biden did was he basically uh, had the intelligence community condemn, to issue a report which condemned the Saudi government for this, and including Mohammed bin Sultan, the crown prince. And he sanctioned something like 170 Saudi individuals that have been directly or indirectly involved in it. Now, this was criticized by some people. For example, my friend Nick Kristof, who's a columnist for the New York Times. Kristof said he should have gone further. He should have said, I will refuse to deal with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince. I think what Biden was saying was, I can't do that because we have other interests and we can't determine who rules Saudi Arabia. So even here, you find a trade-off. In other words, you could say if you take the human rights issue as the only issue, then you don't have a foreign policy, you have a human rights policy. And a foreign policy is a trade-off between different interests, which are economic and security and values. But values are part of our interests. So whether you agree or disagree with the place where Biden drew the line in terms of the trade-off, it's very different from where Trump basically ignored the trade-off and didn't place any emphasis on the values question. So this is an example of the fact that even when you do three-dimensional morality, you can still have disagreements in a democracy about how you do the trade-offs under different circumstances. I think in that sense, when I look back over the various presidents, it was important to realize that none of them had a perfect score. International politics is a difficult game, and it is different from domestic politics. And in that sense, when you did a 3D scorecard for each of the 14 presidents, nobody had a perfect scorecard. On the other hand, some did better than others. I rated the presidents, the four best, as Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush, and half Republicans, half Democrats, so it's a nonpartisan ranking. And I rated the four worst as basically Lyndon Johnson on his foreign policy, not his overall presidency, but on his foreign policy because of the classic mistake of getting us involved in the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon, for the way he continued the Vietnam War. He wanted to get out, but he wanted to get out with what he called a decent interval, which led to another 21,000 Americans being killed for what, in the long run, they knew was going to be a losing proposition. The third in the list of the four bottom presidents was George W. Bush, who basically got there because of his invasion of Iraq that I discussed earlier. And it just as an ironic footnote, it shows that leadership and morality are not genetic, because his father got the top group, he got the bottom group. But more seriously, the fourth person at the bottom was former President Trump. And that was because of his consistent neglect of issues relating to values. In other words, it wasn't because he was defending the national interest or America first. It was because he was defining the national interest in extremely narrow terms, which neglected the role of values as one of our interests. It's who we are as a people to think of our values as part of our interests. So in that sense, the issue or the judgment about what's a moral foreign policy is not easy, and we can disagree. I'm sure many of you will disagree with the rankings that I just mentioned. I should say that the other presidents were stretched out in between the top and the bottom. But the point is not so much that you agree with my ranking. as much as that you agree that morals do matter, and that if morals matter, then we have to think of them in three dimensions, not just as having good intentions. And if we can do that, if we can agree that morals matter, and if we can think in three dimensions, 3D morality, then we can begin to treat more seriously what is really one of the most important questions for our foreign policy is how do you incorporate morals in a way that makes sense? Just to give you a couple of examples, which I discuss in the end of my book, we have to look at the not just the new competition, the great power competition with China and Russia and so forth. We have to look at a new set of issues, which are transnational, and I call it ecological interdependence. If you take something like global climate change, or you take something like pandemics, they don't obey the laws of politics. They obey the laws of physics and biology. And they're not at all concerned about borders or nationality. A COVID virus doesn't care what the nationality is of the human it colonizes and perhaps kills. It just wants to reproduce itself. The only way that we can cope with these new issues, the transnational ecological issues, is to realize that we can't solve them entirely by ourselves. And in that way, we're going to have to learn to cooperate with others at the same time that we'll be competing with them. I call this distinguishing power over others, which is the traditional way we think about it, from power with others. And we're going to have to learn to do both at the same time. In that sense, when we have a competition with China, for example, about China's assertion of jurisdiction over the South China Sea, which the International Court or the Hague Tribunal on the Rule of Law and the Law of the Sea has ruled to be illegal, we send naval patrols through those contested areas to show that we don't accept that. China declaring that it's territorial waters. But at the same time, we're going to have to be able to cooperate with China on issues like climate change. Because if climate change proceeds as it now is, it's going to be extremely damaging both to the US and to China. China can't trade this off as a favor it does for us because if the Himalayan glaciers melt, it'll be extremely destructive to China's agriculture. And similarly, if the Greenland glaciers melt, that might mean that, let's say, the Chesapeake Bay or much of southern Florida will be damaged and underwater. So these are things where we're going to have to learn to cooperate and understand power with others simultaneously with power over others that we see in the great power competition. I've called this, in terms of a relationship with China, a cooperative rivalry. We have to think of both the cooperation and the rivalry at the same time. And the job for a president or a leader is to try to explain that to the American people. Indeed, we have to spend more time, our leaders have to spend more time explaining that this new dimension of international politics, ecological interdependence, is something which should be a much higher portion of our strategy and our security policy. If you think about it for a moment, COVID in the last year and a half has killed more Americans than have died in all our wars since 1945. And if you look at the share of the budget that goes to institutions dealing with this, it's trivial compared to the share of the budget that goes to the Defense Department. And I'm certainly not anti-defense since I used to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense. But it does show that the morality of leadership for the 21st century is going to have to be how to think of American national interests in this broader sense, in this broader context. if we're going to cope with the issues that are going to confront not only us, but our grandchildren. So that's why I think it's important to realize that morals do matter in international politics, and that we have to think in a more sophisticated three-dimensional way as we make those assessments. In any case, let me stop there, because I think the more interesting point, at least from my perspective, is to hear your reactions and answers or rebuttals. So over to you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nye, for your insightful thoughts on the importance of morality in foreign policy. We now have time for some questions from the audience. As our speaker responds to those already sent, you may continue to submit questions via the Facebook or YouTube, or email them to monlyceum@gmail.com. So the first question, Professor Nye, I'm going to stay with the China theme, and I'm going to ask you to be, instead of an academic, a policymaker. So if you were advising President Biden, what would be key components of a moral foreign policy that he needs to pursue to peacefully manage, and I would say manage, and I'm not counter, but manage China's rise?
Well, it's a great question, because it's very much on the table right now. I think the basic problems of developing a strategy toward dealing with China is to either overestimate China or to underestimate China. China has become the world's second largest economy. Some people think it might become the largest economy in terms of gross domestic product in the 2030s. But China also has a lot of weaknesses. Demographically, its labor force peaked in 2015. It has very few allies politically, and in terms of its economy, its growth rate is slowing, and it may not escape the so-called middle income trap that many successful economies have confronted. So we have to get a balance in our view that China is a real problem. We have to stand up to them. For example, the South China Sea example is a perfect illustration. And we also have to realize that China manipulates its international companies in ways that can become a security threat to us, which is why it's appropriate that we not have a company like Huawei building our fifth generation of telecommunications. So we have to stand up to China that way. And at the same time, we have to realize that if we're going to deal with issues like global climate change or pandemics, we're going to have to work with China. There are other areas we need to work with China as well, such as non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and biological weapons. So trying to steer that balance of being tough, but not to fall into the trap of seeing this as a new Cold War, where we anathematize China, but to see it as something where we indeed are tough, but offering to cooperate simultaneously. That's going to be the hard job. So far, I think Biden's gotten this about right. People say, well, Biden is just continuing Trump's tough policies on China. Not really. I remember Trump withdrew us from the Paris Climate Accord. Biden, in fact, has asked John Kerry to meet and negotiate with the Chinese about climate at the same time that we're being tough with them on things like the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. So I think Biden's got a better sense of balance on this, but it's a tough balancing act to carry out.
Okay, thanks, Professor Nye. As a follow-up to that, although it's a very small data set, obviously, if you were put on the spot, and that's kind of what I'm doing, how would you evaluate President Biden so far from the standpoint of a moral foreign policy?
Well, I think Biden is obviously placed much more emphasis on human rights in foreign policy than we saw from President Trump. I think that you can have disagreements with how he's played this. I mean, I gave the example of Nick Kristof's criticism of Biden's response on the Khashoggi affair, that saying that it should have been tougher. On the other hand, uh, to be realistic, we're not going to be able to determine who governs Saudi Arabia or who the crown prince will be. And we are going to have to use and work with Saudi Arabia for stability in the Middle East, both in oil markets and defense of Israel and dealing with terrorism. So I think Biden decided to make the trade-off that I described, but there are others who say he should have been tougher. And there are hard questions like this that come up all the time. Myanmar, where the junta that overthrew Aung San Suu Kyi has been very brutal, or the question of how much do we press hard on issues like the Xinjiang province and the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, and should we stop our other treatments or other cooperation with China at the same time? Again, I think Biden has tried to place a balance on this. It's one can disagree with his decisions on particular instances where he's drawn the line or tried to make the trade-offs, but overall I'd say he's doing pretty well.
Okay, the next question. Would you characterize Henry Kissinger's realpolitik as amoral, or could a policy based on realpolitik have its own morality?
Oh, I think that a politic such as Kissinger described has a moral component to it. Kissinger wrote a book on world order, and he very clearly pointed out that a successful international order depends partly on the balance of power, but partly on a sense of legitimacy. So Henry's, who was once my professor a long time ago, Henry is not quite as simplistically amoral or immoral as people sometimes make him out to be. I say that you should start your analysis of anything, any situation in international politics, with an approach to realism. Because if you get the realism wrong, everything else is going to fail. But what I argue is after you start with realism, you don't stop there. You say, okay, given the circumstances, what can I do to do more about values in addition to the dimensions which I've analyzed through my realpolitik? So I sometimes call myself a liberal realist, which is my dictum is start with realism, but don't start where you stop. Don't stop where you start. You add on to that in terms of saying, do these circumstances allow me to add more values or try to achieve more values? And when you don't do that, when you just do realism and pay no attention to values or legitimacy, you're going to get things wrong.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nye. The next question, I would like you to comment on external influences that impact a president's ability to carry out a moral or less than moral foreign policy. As we know, the pursuit of foreign policy is not exclusively the purview of the president, as there are other influences, whether that's Congress or that president's political future might influence his ability, or God willing, her ability in the future to carry out a moral foreign policy. If you could comment on that.
Well, in a democracy, the president is the strongest voice on foreign policy, but by far from the only voice or influence. The president has to pay attention to the leaders of the Congress who are elected and who by constitutional right have a strong voice on foreign policy. That's why he has an obligation to keep them informed and to listen to their views. He also has to pay attention to the different departments of his government, which often represent different interests, whether it be health interests in HHS, or whether it be economic interests in commerce, or security interests in defense, and so forth. And that's why having a well-functioning National Security Council, which balances these interests and makes sure that each are heard before a decision is made, is important. And there it's interesting to contrast the two President Bushes. The first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, had a process run by his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, which made sure that voices within the government from different departments and points of view were adequately heard. It didn't mean that Bush was going to necessarily follow the last voice, but it did mean that Scowcroft worked a process with his deputy, Robert Gates, to make sure that these different views were heard, which is appropriate in a democracy. And his son, George W. Bush, had a process which was much more skewed. Dick Cheney in the White House had a close alliance with Don Rumsfeld in defense, and it often cut out some of the other departments, such as Colin Powell's State Department and so forth. And so people have said that the NSC process was nowhere near as good under the son, the second Bush, than the first Bush. And when people describe the NSC process under President Trump, they say it barely existed. I mean, yes, there were several NSC advisors, but people say that the orderly progress to make sure that all views were heard was simply very, very truncated. So I think when we make judgments about presidents, we have to pay attention to their decision. As Harry Truman said, the buck stops here on his desk. But the question of what views got to his desk and how he thought them through, and were different interests in democracy heard, even if not determinative in each case, that is important.
Okay, I believe we have time for one more question, Professor Nye. And this question is, you talked about the invasion of Iraq and its moral implications or immoral implications. Do you have a similar view on the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan?
Well, I think the invasion of Afghanistan was a bit different in the sense that the original plan was to prevent Al-Qaeda from using Afghanistan as a base, as they had when they attacked us on 9/11. And then the question was not whether the original plan was inadequate, but we didn't have the proper kind of follow-on. There was a great dispute about whether we should have stayed in and tried to do nation building, which has not succeeded very well. And in the meantime, we diverted our attention more to the Iraq war rather than the Afghan war. So Afghanistan was not a great success in that sense. The initial response of defeating Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, I think we might have found some way to have shortened that and not to have let the mission morph into what it became, which was really beyond our capabilities. So on the three dimensions of having the means to accomplish the expanded mission, I don't think we had those means. But so I think the two cases are somewhat different.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Nye. And before we close, I just want to give you kind of the last word, if you have any final comments for our audience here in Southern New Hampshire.
Well, I just want to say that when somebody writes a book, as I've done on a topic like this, I don't have the last word. Nobody has the last word. And so if you do read my book and you look at some of these cases and say, oh, you're much too hard on Lyndon Johnson, or you didn't give enough credit to Richard Nixon or whatever, I may want to change my own views at some point. I mean, I'm not, as we uncover more facts and as history goes along, we may have different views. The important point is not whether the judgments that I've written down in the book are final or definitive. It's that we each are going to have to think these through for ourselves. And as we think them through, we really have a moral and an intellectual responsibility to think carefully in 3 dimensions and how that varies with the different circumstances. So the things I've said about various presidents at the end, that's not definitive. The idea that we have to spend more time thinking about morals and foreign policy, that's the message I really want to get across.
Okay, well, thank you once again, Professor Nye, on behalf of the Lyceum for sharing your time and your expertise with us. To the audience, we hope that you have enjoyed today's live broadcast of the Monadnock Summer Lyceum. Thank you for your support of our unique 2021 season. Please join us next Sunday, July 25th, to hear Ellen Stofan, the director of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. From 2013 to 2016, she was the chief scientist at NASA, serving as the principal advisor for NASA's strategic planning and programs. The focus of her talk next week will be searching for life beyond Earth, moving from science fiction to science fact. Thank you for your participation and have a wonderful day.